From September 8, 1941, to January 27, 1944, the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, endured one of the longest and most devastating sieges in history. The siege of Leningrad, imposed by Nazi Germany during World War II, lasted for an unimaginable 872 days. The city's inhabitants suffered through extreme starvation, bombardments, and a bitterly cold winter that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers. The city's resilience in the face of such unimaginable hardship has become a symbol of Russian endurance, but the price was horrifying. Over 1 million people died, many from starvation, disease, or exposure, and bodies were left unburied for days, frozen in the streets. For the survivors, the siege left permanent scars, both physical and emotional. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and the collective trauma of those years has left a lasting imprint on Leningrad's history and psyche. In the aftermath of the siege, rumors began to swirl about strange happenings throughout the city. Residents spoke of ghostly apparitions, eerie sounds in the night, and whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The spirits of the dead, it seemed, were still lingering, trapped in a city that had become their tomb. These are the hauntings of Leningrad, where the past refuses to be forgotten, and the whispers of the dead still echo through the streets. Story 1. The Ghosts of Nevsky Prospect. Nevsky Prospect, the grand boulevard of Leningrad, was once the vibrant heart of the city. Lined with shops, cafes, and theaters, it was a place of bustling life and culture. But during the siege, Nevsky Prospect became a place of death and despair. Bombs rained down from the sky, reducing buildings to rubble, and starving citizens trudged along the icy streets, their hollow eyes reflecting the hopelessness of their situation. The bodies of the dead, frozen in the snow, lined the streets for weeks as people struggled to survive in the face of extreme famine. The horrors of those years have left a lasting imprint on Nevsky Prospect, and in the decades since the siege ended, there have been countless reports of strange and unsettling occurrences. Some say the spirits of those who died during the siege still walk the boulevard, trapped in the moment of their death. Others speak of eerie whispers that seem to come from the walls of the buildings, as if the voices of the dead are trying to communicate with the living. One of the earliest and most famous ghost stories associated with Nevsky Prospect comes from the winter of 1947, just a few years after the siege had ended. Anatoly Ivanov, a young man who had survived the siege, was walking along the boulevard late one evening, his breath visible in the icy air. It was a quiet night, the streetlights casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground, and the city was still trying to recover from the devastation it had endured. As Anatoly walked, he noticed a figure standing near the entrance to one of the old buildings along the boulevard. It was a woman, dressed in an elegant fur coat, her head bowed as if she were waiting for someone. The sight was strange. Leningrad was still in the midst of rationing, and no one had been able to afford such luxuries in years. Curious, Anatoly approached the woman, but as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. She stood perfectly still, not reacting to the cold wind that whipped through the street. "Are you all right?" Anatoly asked, his voice shaky. The woman did not respond. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. Anatoly felt a chill run down his spine. He took a step closer, but as he did, the woman turned and began walking slowly down the street, her footsteps leaving no imprint in the snow. Anatoly followed her, calling out, but she did not turn around. Suddenly, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone, as if she had been swallowed by the shadows. Anatoly stood frozen, staring at the spot where the woman had disappeared. He knew then that what he had seen was not a living person. She was a ghost, one of the many who had perished during the siege, and was now condemned to wander the streets of Nevsky Prospect, searching for something that could never be found. In the years that followed, more people reported seeing the woman in the fur coat. She would appear at night, standing silently in the shadows, before disappearing into thin air. Some believed she was the spirit of a wealthy woman who had died of starvation during the siege. Her once opulent lifestyle reduced to a tragic end on the streets of Leningrad. Others thought she was waiting for a loved one who had never returned from the front lines, her soul forever trapped in a city that had become her grave. In addition to ghostly apparitions, many residents of Nevsky Prospect have reported hearing strange, disembodied voices coming from the walls of the old buildings that line the boulevard. These buildings, many of which were damaged during the siege, were used as shelters for families and soldiers alike. As the city was bombarded by artillery and airstrikes, people huddled in basements and makeshift bunkers, waiting for the horror to end. For many, it never did. In the late 1950s, a group of students who had recently moved into an old apartment building on Nevsky Prospect began to experience strange occurrences. The building had been partially destroyed during the siege, but it had since been repaired and converted into student housing. At first, the students thought nothing of the creaks and groans of the old building, assuming it was just the result of its age. But soon, the noises became more distinct whispers, faint but clear, coming from the walls at night. The whispers were in Russian, but the words were jumbled and hard to understand, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. At first, the students tried to ignore it, brushing it off as their imaginations playing tricks on them. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the voices were trying to communicate something urgent. One night, Svetlana Orlova, one of the students, was alone in her room when she heard the whispers again. This time, they were clearer. She could make out fragments of sentences, pleas for help, cries of hunger, and names being called out. The voices seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if the people who had died during the siege were still trapped within the building, their spirits unable to escape. Terrified, Svetlana moved closer to the wall, pressing her ear against it. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard her own name being called. Panicked, she backed away from the wall, her heart racing. She fled the apartment, too scared to stay another minute. Svetlana later learned that the building had been used as a shelter during the siege, and many people had died inside its walls, their bodies buried beneath the rubble. The whispers, she believed, were the voices of those who had perished there, still trying to reach out to the living, desperate to be heard. Another common ghost story from Nevsky Prospect involves the phantom soldiers who are said to march down the boulevard on cold winter nights. During the siege, the Red Army soldiers stationed in Leningrad fought valiantly to defend the city from German forces. Many of them died in the streets, succumbing to wounds, starvation, or exposure to the bitter cold. One of the most chilling encounters with these ghostly soldiers occurred in 1968, when Sergei Volkov, a taxi driver, was working the late shift. It was a bitterly cold night in January, and the streets were nearly empty as people huddled inside their homes to escape the freezing temperatures. As Sergei drove down Nevsky Prospect, his headlights illuminated something that made him slam on the brakes. Marching down the middle of the street was a group of soldiers, dozens of them, dressed in the tattered uniforms of the Red Army. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They marched in perfect formation, their boots making no sound on the frozen pavement. Sergei watched in stunned silence as the soldiers passed by his taxi, their expressions blank, as though they were unaware of his presence. The air around them was deathly cold, and Sergei could see the frost forming on the inside of his windshield. He wanted to turn the car around, to flee, but his hands were frozen in place on the steering wheel. The soldiers continued marching down the street, their figures fading into the distance until they disappeared into the darkness. Sergei sat in his taxi for several minutes, too shaken to move. He later told his friends about the encounter, but many of them laughed it off, saying it was just the cold playing tricks on him. But Sergei knew what he had seen. The soldiers were not of this world. They were the spirits of the men who had died defending Leningrad, still marching through the streets they had once fought to protect. In the years that followed, other residents of Leningrad reported seeing similar apparitions of ghostly soldiers marching down Nevsky Prospect in the dead of night, their frozen faces a haunting reminder of the price the city had paid during the siege. Nevsky Prospect, once the bustling heart of Leningrad, is now a place where the past and present intertwine. The horrors of the siege left an indelible mark on the city, and the spirits of those who died during those brutal years seemed to linger, unable to find peace. From the ghostly woman in the fur coat to the whispers in the walls, the boulevard is filled with echoes of the past, reminders of a time when death and despair ruled the streets. For those who walk Nevsky Prospect today, the ghosts of the siege are never far away. The frozen soldiers who march silently through the night, the voices of the dead that whisper from the shadows, and the apparitions that appear and vanish without a trace, all serve as haunting reminders of the city's darkest days. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the stories of Nevsky Prospect offer a glimpse into a history that refuses to be forgotten. A history filled with suffering, resilience, and the enduring spirit of a city that survived one of the most devastating sieges in human history. Story 2: The Ghosts of Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery. Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, is one of the most poignant and tragic sites connected to the siege. It is a resting place for nearly 500,000 people who perished during the 872-day blockade. Many of the graves are mass burials, frozen bodies of men, women, children, and soldiers laid to rest in communal pits, victims of starvation, disease, exposure, and German artillery fire. The cold ground of Piskaryovskoye Cemetery became a silent witness to the brutal realities of war. The cemetery's silence is a far cry from the chaos that gripped the city during the siege. In those years, carts carrying the bodies of the dead passed through its gates every day, often with no family members left to mourn. Workers buried hundreds at a time in trenches dug hastily into the frozen earth, with little ceremony or dignity. The bodies piled up faster than the city could keep pace, and many victims were buried without even a name to mark their passing. After the siege ended, the cemetery was turned into a memorial, a solemn place of reflection and remembrance. A giant statue of the motherland now stands at the entrance, her grieving figure looking over the rows of burial mounds where the dead lay. But despite its peaceful exterior, many believe that the souls of those buried in Piskaryovskoye have not found peace. Visitors and caretakers have reported strange occurrences, whispers on the wind, the sensation of being watched, and ghostly apparitions appearing among the graves. It is said that the spirits of those who died in agony during the siege still haunt the cemetery, searching for the peace they were denied in life. One of the most famous ghost stories associated with Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery dates back to the early 1960s, not long after the cemetery was officially consecrated as a memorial site. Vera Kuznetsova, a schoolteacher who had lived through the siege, often visited the cemetery to pay her respects to her family members who had been buried there in one of the mass graves. Vera had lost her husband, her parents, and her younger brother during the siege, and the cemetery had become a place of solace for her, a quiet corner where she could grieve. One cold winter evening, as she stood by the gravesite, Vera heard something strange. At first, it was just the faint sound of wind moving through the trees, but soon it became clear that the sound was something else entirely. It was the sound of someone crying a woman's soft, mournful sobs, coming from somewhere nearby. Story 2: The Ghosts of Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery. Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, is one of the most poignant and tragic sites connected to the siege. It is a resting place for nearly 500,000 people who perished during the 872-day blockade. Many of the graves are mass burials, frozen bodies of men, women, children, and soldiers laid to rest in communal pits, victims of starvation, disease, exposure, and German artillery fire. The cold ground of Piskaryovskoye Cemetery became a silent witness to the brutal realities of war. The cemetery's silence is a far cry from the chaos that gripped the city during the siege. In those years, carts carrying the bodies of the dead passed through its gates every day, often with no family members left to mourn. Workers buried hundreds at a time in trenches dug hastily into the frozen earth, with little ceremony or dignity. The bodies piled up faster than the city could keep pace, and many victims were buried without even a name to mark their passing. After the siege ended, the cemetery was turned into a memorial, a solemn place of reflection and remembrance. A giant statue of the motherland now stands at the entrance, her grieving figure looking over the rows of burial mounds where the dead lay. But despite its peaceful exterior, many believe that the souls of those buried in Piskaryovskoye have not found peace. Visitors and caretakers have reported strange occurrences, whispers on the wind, the sensation of being watched, and ghostly apparitions appearing among the graves. It is said that the spirits of those who died in agony during the siege still haunt the cemetery, searching for the peace they were denied in life. One of the most famous ghost stories associated with Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery dates back to the early 1960s, not long after the cemetery was officially consecrated as a memorial site. Vera Kuznetsova, a schoolteacher who had lived through the siege, often visited the cemetery to pay her respects to her family members who had been buried there in one of the mass graves. Vera had lost her husband, her parents, and her younger brother during the siege, and the cemetery had become a place of solace for her, a quiet corner where she could grieve. One cold winter evening, as she stood by the gravesite, Vera heard something strange. At first, it was just the faint sound of wind moving through the trees, but soon it became clear that the sound was something else entirely. It was the sound of someone crying a woman's soft, mournful sobs, coming from somewhere nearby. As they made their way toward the central memorial, one of the students, Igor Smirnov, stopped suddenly. He had heard something faint, almost like a murmur, but unmistakable. It was the sound of voices, low and distant, as if they were coming from beneath the ground. Igor called out to his friends, and soon they all stood in silence, listening intently. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, drifting through the fog like ghostly echoes. The students could not make out what the voices were saying, but there was something deeply unsettling about the sound. It was as if the dead were trying to speak. Their voices carried on the wind, pleading for someone to hear them. The whispers grew louder, and Igor could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His friends, unnerved, suggested they leave, but Igor wanted to investigate further. He walked slowly toward one of the larger burial mounds, his footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass. As he reached the mound, the whispers abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Igor stood frozen, staring at the grave. He later described the experience as one of the most terrifying moments of his life. The voices, he believed, were the spirits of the people buried beneath the earth, still crying out for help, still trapped in the misery of their final days. In the years since, many visitors to the cemetery have reported hearing similar whispers, especially on cold, windy days when the air is thick with the weight of history. Some claim that the voices speak in Russian, calling out names or asking for food, while others say they have heard the sounds of children crying, their voices mingling with the rustle of the wind through the trees. One of the most eerie phenomena reported at Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery is the appearance of a phantom funeral procession that is said to take place in the early hours of the morning, just as the sun begins to rise. According to witnesses, a line of shadowy figures can sometimes be seen moving slowly through the cemetery, carrying what appears to be a coffin draped in a shroud. The figures are silent, their heads bowed, as they walk in solemn procession toward the mass graves. The first known sighting of the phantom procession occurred in 1980, when a group of cemetery workers arrived early one morning to prepare for a memorial service. As they approached the cemetery gates, they saw what they thought was a funeral procession making its way through the fog. At first, they didn't think much of it, assuming it was part of a pre-dawn service for the victims of the siege. But as they watched, the workers realized something was terribly wrong. The figures in the procession were indistinct, their faces blurred, and their bodies barely visible through the mist. The coffin they carried seemed to float above the ground, and the air around them was eerily still, as though time itself had stopped. Terrified, the workers backed away, unsure of what they were seeing. The procession continued toward the graves, and as the last figure passed through the fog, the entire scene faded from view, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Since that first sighting, others have reported seeing the phantom procession, always in the early hours of the morning, always shrouded in fog. Some believe the figures are the spirits of those who died during the siege, still performing the rituals of death even after all these years. Others think the procession is a reenactment of one of the many mass burials that took place during the blockade, a tragic reminder of the countless lives lost. Perhaps the most heartbreaking of all the ghost stories associated with Piskaryovskoye Cemetery are those involving the spirits of children who died during the siege. It is estimated that tens of thousands of children perished in Leningrad during the blockade, many of them succumbing to starvation, illness, or exposure to the freezing temperatures. These children, too young to fully understand the horrors unfolding around them, are said to haunt the cemetery, their playful spirits forever trapped in a place of sorrow. In 1989, a young woman named Yelena Markova visited Piskaryovskoye Cemetery to lay flowers on her grandmother's grave. It was a bright summer day, and the cemetery was unusually peaceful, with birds chirping in the trees and the sun casting long shadows over the graves. As Yelena walked through the cemetery, she suddenly heard the sound of laughter. It was the joyful, carefree sound of children playing, but it struck her as odd. The cemetery was usually a quiet, somber place, and she hadn't seen any children nearby. Curious, Yelena followed the sound, weaving her way through the rows of graves. To her surprise, she saw a group of children playing near one of the larger burial mounds. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, coats, and hats that looked like they belonged to another era, and they were running and laughing, seemingly oblivious to Yelena's presence. As she watched, one of the children, a little girl with dark hair and a red scarf, turned and smiled at her, but something was wrong. The girl's face, though sweet and innocent, was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes had a hollow, faraway look. Yelena took a step back, her heart pounding. The children continued to play, but as Yelena watched, their laughter grew fainter, and their figures began to fade, disappearing into the sunlight. Shaken, Yelena quickly left the cemetery, but the memory of the ghostly children stayed with her. She later learned that many of the children who had died during the siege had been buried in mass graves at Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, their families too grief-stricken or too weak to give them proper funerals. The spirits of these children, Yelena believed, were still there, playing among the graves, unaware that their lives had been cut short by the horrors of war. Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery is a place of deep sorrow and remembrance, a final resting place for the hundreds of thousands who perished during the siege of Leningrad. But for many, it is also a place where the spirits of the dead linger, unable to move on from the tragic events that claimed their lives. From the weeping woman who mourns at the gravesite to the phantom funeral procession that marches silently through the fog, the cemetery is filled with echoes of the past. The whispers of the dead, the ghostly children playing among the graves, and the voices carried on the wind serve as haunting reminders of the suffering and loss that defined the siege. For those who visit Piskaryovskoye Cemetery today, the presence of the dead is impossible to ignore. The weight of history hangs heavy in the air, and the spirits of the siege seem to watch over the graves, their stories waiting to be told. Whether one believes in the supernatural or not, the cemetery's haunted legacy ensures that the memory of the siege of Leningrad will never be forgotten. Story 3: The Phantom Bunker Beneath the City. During the siege of Leningrad, much of the city's population sought refuge in underground bunkers and basements. These makeshift shelters, dug deep beneath the city's streets, were meant to protect the people from the relentless artillery bombardment and air raids that rained down on Leningrad day after day. For many, the dark, cramped bunkers became a second home. Entire families, along with soldiers and civil defense forces, huddled together underground, enduring unimaginable conditions as they waited for the siege to end. But for thousands, the bunkers became tombs. Starvation, disease, and the bitter cold claimed many lives, and bodies were often left where they fell, the survivors too weak to bury the dead. The air in the bunkers was thick with the smell of decay, and the sounds of weeping, coughing, and the distant rumble of explosions filled the darkness. After the siege ended, many of these bunkers were abandoned, sealed off, or repurposed, but the memory of what happened in those suffocating underground spaces remained. In the years since, rumors have persisted that some of these bunkers are haunted by the souls of those who died there. It is said that the dead still linger in the tunnels beneath Leningrad, their spirits unable to find peace. Those who venture too deep into the city's forgotten bunkers report hearing strange noises, whispers, footsteps, and the cries of the dying echoing through the darkness. In the early 1960s, a group of young explorers decided to venture into one of the long-abandoned bunkers beneath Leningrad. The group, led by Boris Sokolov, had grown up hearing stories about the siege and had always been fascinated by the idea of exploring the city's underground world. Many of the bunkers had been sealed off after the war, but some remained accessible through hidden entrances in the basements of old buildings. One chilly autumn evening, Boris and his friends, armed with flashlights and ropes, descended into a bunker that had once served as a shelter for civilians and soldiers alike. The entrance, concealed behind a crumbling wall in an old apartment building, led them down a steep set of stairs into the earth. As they made their way deeper into the bunker, the air grew colder, and the faint sounds of the city above faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. The bunker was a maze of narrow corridors and small empty rooms, most of which had been stripped bare long ago. The walls were damp, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, disturbed only by the occasional rat scurrying through the darkness. Boris and his friends explored in silence, the weight of the bunker's history pressing down on them. As they ventured deeper, Boris began to feel uneasy. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the beam of his flashlight flickered as if struggling to pierce the darkness. Then, without warning, they heard a faint, distant sound that echoed through the tunnels. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, the group thought it might be another group of explorers, but as they listened, the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. There was something off about the sound. It didn't match the shuffling steps of someone walking through the darkness. These were marching footsteps, rhythmic and precise, as if an entire squad of soldiers were moving through the tunnels. Boris signaled for the group to stop, and they listened in tense silence. The footsteps drew closer, echoing off the walls, but there was no sign of anyone else in the bunker. Boris's heart raced as the sound grew louder, until it seemed as though the unseen soldiers were right beside them. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The bunker fell silent once more, and the group stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Boris's flashlight flickered again, and in the dim light he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing at the far end of the corridor, barely visible in the darkness, was a group of shadowy figures. They were dressed in the uniforms of Soviet soldiers, their faces pale and expressionless. They stood in perfect formation, as though waiting for orders. For a moment, the figures remained still, their eyes fixed on the group. Then, without a sound, they turned and marched down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. Terrified, Boris and his friends scrambled to find their way back to the surface. As they rushed through the tunnels, they could still hear the faint sound of marching behind them, as if the phantom soldiers were following them through the darkness. When they finally emerged from the bunker, breathless and shaken, none of them spoke for several minutes. Boris later learned that the bunker they had explored had been used by Soviet soldiers during the siege, many of whom had died underground from starvation and disease. The figures they had seen, Boris believed, were the spirits of those soldiers, still trapped in the bunker, endlessly marching through the darkness in search of a victory that never came. In the years after the siege, many of the underground bunkers and tunnels beneath Leningrad were sealed off, but a few remained accessible to those brave or foolish enough to explore them. Over time, these abandoned spaces became the focus of urban legends, with stories of ghostly encounters and strange phenomena circulating among the city's residents. One of the most chilling stories comes from Anya Lebedeva, a student at Leningrad State University in the 1970s. Anya, like many others in the city, had heard the tales of haunted bunkers and had always been curious about the truth behind the legends. One evening, she and a group of friends decided to explore one of the more infamous bunkers, located beneath an old factory on the outskirts of the city. The factory had been heavily bombed during the siege, and the bunker below it had served as a shelter for the workers and their families. Many of those who had taken refuge there had died, their bodies left to rot in the cold, damp tunnels. Anya and her friends descended into the bunker, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. As they made their way deeper into the underground labyrinth, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease grew stronger. The bunker was eerily quiet, save for the occasional drip of water echoing through the tunnels. But then, as they turned a corner, they heard something that made them stop in their tracks. It was the sound of voices. At first, the voices were faint, little more than whispers that seemed to drift through the air. But as the group stood still, listening, the voices grew louder. There were many of them, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of sound. Anya could hear fragments of sentences, pleas for help, cries of hunger, and the names of loved ones being called out in desperation. The voices seemed to come from all around them, as though the walls of the bunker themselves were speaking. Anya's heart raced as she realized that the voices were not coming from any living person. They were the echoes of the dead, the spirits of those who had died in the bunker, still crying out for help long after their bodies had been laid to rest. Terrified, Anya and her friends fled the bunker, the voices following them all the way to the surface. When they finally emerged into the cool night air, Anya could still hear the faint murmur of the voices, as though they were calling out to her from the depths of the earth. In the weeks that followed, Anya had nightmares about the voices. She would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she could hear the same whispers coming from the walls of her apartment. She later learned that the bunker they had explored had been one of the most heavily bombed during the siege, and that many of the people who had taken refuge there had died in agony, their bodies never properly buried. While many of the ghost stories associated with Leningrad's bunkers involve strange noises and apparitions, one of the most bizarre and unsettling tales is that of the disappearing bunker, a place that seems to exist only in the twilight between the living and the dead. In 1985, a construction crew working in central Leningrad stumbled upon the entrance to an old bunker that had been sealed off since the end of the siege. The bunker had been forgotten for decades, buried beneath layers of rubble and debris, and the workers were excited by the prospect of uncovering a piece of history. The foreman, Ivan Petrov, decided to lead a small group of workers into the bunker to assess its condition before any further excavation took place. The entrance to the bunker was a narrow staircase that descended deep into the earth. As they made their way down, Ivan and his team noticed that the air grew colder with each step. The walls were lined with rusting pipes, and the floor was slick with moisture. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, they were met with an unsettling sight. The bunker was not empty. In the dim light of their flashlights, they could see the shapes of people, dozens of them, sitting on the ground or leaning against the walls. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their clothes ragged and torn. They looked like refugees, frozen in time, waiting for help that had never arrived. Ivan called out to the group, but there was no response. The figures remained still, unmoving, their eyes fixed on the ground. As Ivan and his team moved closer, they realized with horror that the figures were not alive. They were ghosts, the spirits of those who had died in the bunker during the siege. Before Ivan could react, the air around him grew cold, and the lights of his flashlight flickered. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the figures began to fade, disappearing into the darkness. In a panic, Ivan and his team scrambled to leave the bunker, their hearts racing as they climbed the stairs. When they reached the surface, they were met with another shock. The entrance to the bunker had disappeared. The staircase they had just climbed had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of earth and rubble. It was as if the bunker had never existed. The construction crew was baffled, but Ivan knew what he had seen. The bunker was real, but it existed in a place beyond the physical world, a shadowy remnant of the past that had been lost to time. The spirits of those who had died there were still trapped, caught in a loop of suffering and despair, their souls unable to escape the darkness. Leningrad's underground bunkers, once a place of refuge during the brutal siege, have become haunted remnants of the city's darkest days. The souls of those who died in the cold, damp tunnels still linger, trapped in a world between life and death. From the ghostly soldiers who march through the darkness to the voices of the dead that echo through the walls, the bunkers are filled with the echoes of a past that refuses to be forgotten. For those brave enough to venture into the forgotten spaces beneath the city, the presence of the dead is palpable. The air is heavy with sorrow, and the walls seem to whisper the stories of those who perished there. The spirits of Leningrad's bunkers are a haunting reminder of the suffering endured during the siege, a testament to the lives lost in the darkest chapter of the city's history. Whether one believes in the supernatural or not, the stories of Leningrad's haunted bunkers offer a glimpse into the lasting impact of the siege, a place where the living and the dead walk side by side, and where the ghosts of the past still linger in the shadows. Story 4. The Haunting of the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace, located on the banks of the Neva River, is one of the most iconic landmarks in St. Petersburg, a symbol of Imperial Russia and the seat of the Russian monarchy for centuries. During the siege of Leningrad, however, it served a very different purpose. The palace, once filled with grandeur and wealth, became a fortress, a stronghold of survival amid the devastation of war. During the siege, parts of the Winter Palace were transformed into makeshift hospitals, while others housed military command centers. The vast halls and ballrooms that had once hosted royal banquets now echoed with the cries of the wounded and dying. Medical staff worked around the clock to tend to soldiers and civilians alike, many of whom succumbed to their injuries or to the starvation that ravaged the city. The grand opulence of the palace faded as the war dragged on, and it became a grim reminder of the suffering that gripped Leningrad. Even after the siege ended, the Winter Palace retained an atmosphere of sorrow. Despite restoration efforts to return the building to its former glory, many who worked or visited the palace after the war spoke of a lingering presence of spirits of those who had died within its walls during the siege. Whispers of ghostly apparitions, eerie footsteps, and strange occurrences began to circulate among the palace staff, leading many to believe that the Winter Palace had become haunted by the tragedies of its wartime past. One of the earliest and most well-known ghost stories from the Winter Palace comes from the late 1940s, when the building was still being used as a recovery center for the wounded. Irina Zhdanova, a young nurse who had started working at the palace shortly after the siege ended, was one of the many medical staff tasked with caring for the soldiers who had survived the horrors of the blockade. Though the war was over, the hospital remained busy with patients suffering from the after-effects of malnutrition, injuries, and trauma. One cold winter night, Irina was working the night shift, making her rounds through the palace's grand corridors, which had been converted into hospital wards. The palace was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional cough or groan from the patients. As she entered one of the old ballrooms, now filled with rows of beds, she noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, near one of the grand windows overlooking the Neva, a man in a doctor's uniform was standing by a patient's bed, his back to her. Irina didn't recognize him, but she assumed he was one of the many doctors who had been brought in to help with the overwhelming number of patients. She approached him to ask if he needed assistance, but as she got closer, something about the man struck her as odd. His uniform was outdated, the style and cut reminiscent of the early 20th century rather than the current medical attire. His posture was stiff, and he did not seem to hear her approach. "Doctor?" Irina called out softly. The man did not respond. He continued to stand by the bed, his head slightly bowed as though deep in thought. Irina felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped closer, reaching out to tap his shoulder. But just as her hand was about to touch him, the man turned and vanished before her eyes. Irina gasped, stumbling backward in shock. The bed where the doctor had been standing was empty, the sheets undisturbed. There was no sign of the patient or the mysterious figure. Terrified, Irina ran to find her supervisor, but when she returned to the ballroom with two other nurses, there was no trace of the ghostly doctor. In the days that followed, Irina learned from some of the older staff that she was not the first to see the phantom doctor. He had been spotted by several nurses over the years, always at night, always tending to patients who were no longer there. Some believed he was the spirit of a doctor who had died during the siege, unable to save his patients and now condemned to roam the palace, forever trying to heal the wounded souls lost to war. During the siege, parts of the Winter Palace that had once housed priceless works of art were repurposed as shelters and storage areas for the city's most valuable treasures. The Hermitage Museum, which shares the palace grounds, moved many of its exhibits into the palace's secure underground vaults to protect them from the constant bombings. However, despite these efforts, the palace and its art collections suffered significant damage during the siege, with many rooms reduced to rubble and priceless artworks lost forever. In the years following the war, the palace's art galleries were restored, and the grand rooms that once displayed paintings and sculptures were reopened to the public. Yet, for some, the galleries retained an unsettling atmosphere, as if the trauma of the siege had left a permanent mark on the very walls. One evening in 1957, a group of curators working late in the Rembrandt Gallery experienced something they would never forget. The gallery, which had been painstakingly restored after the war, was now home to some of the Hermitage's most valuable paintings. The curators, led by Viktor Romanov, were finishing up a late-night inventory when the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. At first, Viktor thought it was just a draft, but as he and his colleagues continued their work, they began to hear strange whispers, faint but unmistakable, as if someone were speaking just out of earshot. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, drifting through the air like distant echoes. The curators exchanged nervous glances, but tried to brush it off as their imagination. Then, as Victor approached one of the paintings, a portrait of an aristocratic woman, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Reflected in the glass of the frame was the image of a woman, dressed in a long, elegant gown, standing just behind him. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Victor spun around, but the gallery was empty. The woman, it seemed, was not a living person. Terrified, Victor called out to his colleagues, but they, too, had seen the ghostly figure. The woman had appeared in the reflections of several paintings, her form faint and flickering, as though she were caught between this world and the next. She moved silently through the gallery, her gaze never leaving the paintings, before fading into the shadows. The curators later learned that many of the palace's former residents had died during the siege, and it was believed that the ghostly woman was one of them. Some speculated that she had once been a visitor to the palace, perhaps an aristocrat who had attended royal events in the grand ballrooms. Others thought she might have been one of the many civilians who had taken refuge in the palace during the blockade, only to die of starvation or illness. Whoever she was, her spirit seemed to be tied to the art she had once admired, forever wandering the galleries in search of the beauty that had been lost to the war. One of the most famous and eerie rooms in the Winter Palace is the Nicholas Hall, a vast ballroom that once hosted grand balls and royal events during the reign of the Romanovs. The hall, with its high ceilings, gleaming chandeliers, and polished marble floors, was a symbol of Imperial Russia's wealth and power. But during the siege, the ballroom fell into disuse, its once lavish decorations covered in dust and debris. After the war, the ballroom was restored, but many of those who worked in the palace claimed that it was never truly the same. Strange occurrences began to take place in Nicholas Hall, unexplained footsteps, the faint sound of music playing late at night, and most chillingly, the appearance of ghostly figures dancing across the floor. In 1965, Sergei Antonov, a security guard at the Winter Palace, experienced one of the most unsettling encounters in the ballroom's haunted history. Sergei had been assigned to patrol the palace at night, a job he took seriously. One evening, as he made his way through the empty halls, he heard the unmistakable sound of orchestral music drifting through the air. At first, Sergei thought it must be a mistake. Perhaps a radio had been left on somewhere in the palace. But as he approached Nicholas Hall, the music grew louder, filling the corridor with the sound of violins and pianos playing a waltz. His heart pounding, Sergei opened the doors to the ballroom and froze. The grand hall was bathed in a soft, ethereal light, and on the marble floor, a group of ghostly figures was dancing. Men in military uniforms and women in elegant gowns twirled across the room, their movements graceful and fluid. The dancers were pale and translucent, their faces expressionless as they moved to the rhythm of the music. Sergei stood in stunned silence, watching as the figures continued their spectral dance. The air around him was cold, and he could see his breath in the dim light. For a moment it felt as though time had stopped, and he was watching a scene from a bygone era, frozen in time. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The figures paused mid-step, their ghostly forms flickering like candles in the wind, before fading into the darkness. The ballroom fell silent once more, and Sergei was left standing alone, his heart racing. Shaken, Sergei reported the incident to his superiors, but they dismissed it as a trick of the light or his imagination. However, he later learned that other guards and palace staff had experienced similar encounters in Nicholas Hall. The ghostly dancers, it seemed, were the spirits of those who had attended the grand balls of Imperial Russia, forever reliving the elegance and beauty of a world that had been lost to war and revolution. Another well-known haunting in the Winter Palace involves a window on the second floor, overlooking the Neva River. During the siege, this window was shattered by artillery fire, and several soldiers who had taken refuge in the palace were killed when the blast tore through the room. In 1974, a group of workers was tasked with repairing the damaged window and restoring the room to its former glory. Among them was Yuri Mikhailov, a carpenter who had spent years working on various restoration projects throughout the city. As Yuri and his team worked to replace the glass, strange things began to happen. The first sign that something was wrong came when Yuri heard a faint tapping sound on the window, as if someone were knocking from the outside. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as the day wore on, the tapping grew more insistent. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, as though someone were trying to get his attention. Later that afternoon, as Yuri stood by the window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Reflected in the glass was the image of a soldier, dressed in a tattered Soviet uniform. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with hunger and exhaustion. The soldier stood just behind Yuri, his hand raised as though knocking on the window. Yuri spun around, but the room was empty. The soldier was gone. Shaken, Yuri tried to continue his work, but the image of the ghostly soldier lingered in his mind. He later learned that several soldiers had died in that very room during the siege, their bodies left behind as the war raged on. The window, it seemed, was a portal between the living and the dead, a place where the spirits of those who had perished could reach out to the world they had left behind. The Winter Palace, once the seat of the Russian monarchy and a symbol of imperial grandeur, became a place of death and despair during the siege of Leningrad. The suffering that unfolded within its walls left an indelible mark on the building, and many believe that the spirits of those who died there still linger, unable to find peace. From the phantom doctor tending to patients long gone, to the ghostly figures dancing in the ballroom, the palace is filled with the echoes of its tragic past. The whispers of the dead, the sound of music playing late into the night, and the appearance of ghostly soldiers are all reminders of the horrors endured during the siege. For those who visit the Winter Palace today, the grandeur of the past is always accompanied by the presence of the dead. The spirits of Leningrad's darkest days continue to haunt the palace, a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of a city that survived one of the most brutal sieges in human history.